Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, I'm Joanna G. Holden, and I am a fantasy author and author-tuber whose debut novel, as it happens, just recently came out in the ebook. It is a middle grade fairy tale retelling. If that sounds interesting, be sure to look in the description box below for the link and the information. But for now, I'm going to jump right into this video. I'm already out of breath. I've been going all day. Okay, so today's video is very exciting because it is actually the first request video that I am doing here on my channel. It's actually 2 requests combined into one, and yes, just so you know, my nails are horrible. I just put this on 2 days ago. I have horrible nail polish. I have got to get something better. Anyways, hope that's not a distraction, because sometimes it is for me. But yes, video requests. There were 2 requests for today's video. The first was a request that I talk about how I got started writing novels, how I developed the process and system that I currently have, just kind of my journey to becoming a writer. Second was a request for novel writing tips for beginners, like people who have never written a novel before, how to get into writing novels, and so on and so forth. So I thought I would do both together and kind of sandwich them in here because I feel like it's very inspiring to hear how someone else did something before you hear their advice on what you should do. And just to be clear, and very upfront with you, I do not hold all the answers. I'm never going to pretend that I hold all the answers. I'm learning new things all the time. In fact, my greatest love for writing is that there is no set rule book that says this is how every single person has to do it. I'm rambling at this point. Point being, I do not believe that there's any one set way that everyone should write a novel. However, I do also believe that we learn our best from sharing our experiences and from watching and listening to the experiences of others. We can get a lot of inspiration, a lot of ideas just by listening to how other people do things. So the first half of this video will be my journey to becoming a novel writer. It will be short, no worries. And then the second half of the video is going to be from this perspective, what advice would I have for just starting novel writing and how to get into it, and maybe some beginner steps and some how-tos, more tutorial-esque. So my writing journey. I never know how to answer this question when people ask, like, when did you start writing novels? Because I feel like the answer is kind of cheating. I always have been writing. I don't remember a time when I wasn't writing. In fact, I have the very first story that I ever finished, which was a school project when I was 6 years old. And let me see if I have it, actually. I have all the books that I've written. It was this little guy. Isn't it cute? Carilla's Change, and I illustrated it myself. See if I can find a picture. Lovely illustrations, and then my mom had, like, I think it was like a couple hundred words. Isn't that cute? And look at cute little 6-year-old me. Anywho, that's the first recorded book of mine that I have. Sorry, my hair is bothering me. That's the first recorded book that I have, and since then, I have been writing stories out my ears and driving my poor family crazy in the process. I spent the next, I want to say 10 years, all the way up until I was like 15 and 16, just writing random story ideas, story beginnings. I used to make little construction paper booklets and fill them with little pages and handwrite little stories with hand-done illustration. And I have made it a purpose to not throw away story ideas since I was like, I want to say 15. So I actually still have quite a lot of my story ideas from when I was like 10 and up. I didn't learn how to finish a full-length novel until I was in my teen years, except for school projects that we did almost every year. We were homeschooled, and every year as part of our learning experience, we would take a month's break from regular school, other than like math and stuff, because you have to do that anyways. And we would focus on writing a short story, which we would then learn how to hand bind in a book and make covers for. And then while we were doing that, we would also be reading up on favorite authors and illustrators and learning more about the book writing process from their perspective, reading lots of good stories. It was just a fun experience, and I still have all of those. I have 2 of them here. I have another one that I wrote when I was like 7 or 8. And then this one never got a cover. And then I have an entire notebook here that is just like story ideas that I've kept. All that to say, I have been a busy writer for as long as I could remember. When I was 10 years old was when the first of the Lord of the Rings films came into theater, And I went to see the very last showing at the Dollar Theater. Do y'all remember Dollar Theaters? It was like an hour from our house. My mom took me there as a surprise because we'd actually finished reading the book just before it went out of theater. And so she took me because she was just too excited, and I freaking loved it. And I fell in love with fantasy at that point. I'd always loved fantasy like Narnia, Wizard of Oz, but when I saw that movie, I fell in love with the idea of writing an epic fantasy and of course having it turned into a giant novel. A giant movie, like a big movie series. So from that point on, I began to focus more on actually writing a full book. It didn't happen other than school for quite a few more years. Then I hit about 15, and some friends of mine and none of us had actually met in person at that point, but we were writer pen pals, and we all got together and said, hey, let's do this fun project. So we wrote these letters to each other as these characters in this basic story concept, basic world concept, and ended up writing six novels through letters to each other. One from each of us. And that was the first time that I had ever completed a project like that, like a project of that magnitude. It took place over the course of 2 years. And I think I was about 17, I went ahead and I rewrote the letters into an actual manuscript format, a narrative format, first person, past tense, and third person past tense, because there was multiple POVs. And we, at that point, CreateSpace was the thing to do. So I did one, and one of my other friends completed hers into a novel. And we had them bound and printed from CreateSpace. This was mine. I had my own illustrations and everything. But look how thick that was. For a 17/18-year-old, how old was I when I wrote this? So this came out in 2012, so I was about 19 when I finally finished this thing. But this was a big deal for me. I had never finished my own novel, let alone this length, let alone had it bound and printed. I mean, this was a proof copy. We didn't publish it or anything. But it was a huge deal for me. From that point on, it became a serious deal for me. I want to write novels and I want to publish them, and I'm going to make this like my lifelong career. Now, I still knew nothing really about writing other than getting the story down on paper and going back and fixing it as best that I could. I knew nothing about plot structure, outlining. In fact, I think I was about 18 or 19 when I first learned anything about outlining other than just writing down what ideas I had for scenes in the list of what I thought they were going to be, and then just kind of going off of that when I drafted. I pantsed a lot, and I plotted a lot, and I did everything in between. I just wrote books. That was what I did for upwards of 10 years. I just wrote stories, and most of them, in fact, all but like 3 of them never got finished, but I was always writing on something. I was always working with my ideas. I was always having fun just writing and reading on top of that. I read a lot during that time. And that was really, I think, what got me to where I was when I first got married. I was 21? No, I was 20. I was 20 when I got married. There we go. So I was 20 years old when I got married, moved away from home, and started thinking about actually publishing a book. Now, at this point in time, self-publishing was just becoming like a legitimate thing that people were like actually not viewing in a negative way. And I had a friend who suggested that I self-publish through this little self-publishing indie publishing hub when I came up with the idea for my first fairy tale retelling, which was called Littlehood. And I decided to go for it. And I went for it. And I wrote the book. I paid for illustrations. My friend put together a little homemade cover for me, did all the formatting for both of the books, I think the ebook and the paperback, and we just popped it up on what at that point again was CreateSpace, up on Amazon, and just waited to see what happened. And it was a very disappointing thing when I realized that there was really nothing that happened. Like, nobody bought it, nobody read it, and it was very discouraging, but in a good way. It taught me that I couldn't just write my books and throw them up online and hope that someone might buy them someday. And it was a very good thing for me, because when I realized that, that was when I became truly serious about pursuing writing as a business. Not just writing to have fun, not just writing to throw books up online, but actually sitting down and writing as a business, taking it seriously, learning more about it, pursuing it as a career, actually looking things up and studying marketing and formatting and structure and process and everything. That was where that part of my journey began. I want to say I was 22 years old about when it really got started for me. But I still didn't write very much for the next couple of years, and it wasn't until about 2017 that I really began to hone my process. 2018 rolled around, and I really began to hone it more. 2019, this past year, rolled around, and I finally felt like I was getting somewhere. I wrote multiple books, and I actually felt like they were good, solid books. I edited and edited. Again, with the first one, I actually got beta readers, which are just complete strangers who read your book for you and give you criticism back. And I hired a professional editor for the first time in my life. I hired a professional cover designer. I actually set up my author platform. I started working on marketing my own books. All of that happened within the last 2 years. But that is it as far as my journey goes. Sorry, my legs are falling asleep from sitting on the floor. That is my writing journey in as few words as possible. I know it sounds like I was rambling forever. Really what worked for me was just to write and to keep writing. And then slowly over time, I began to be more exposed to more and more different things that would help me to learn how to write better and how to figure out what kind of publishing platform works for me. So I hope that that was in any way inspiring to you. Now to move on to my suggestion for people who are just starting to write a novel. Because I've been writing for so long, I've always felt a little bit hesitant to answer this question as well, just because all of my experience is as someone who has just been writing stories for forever. So ideas on how do you get a story idea, how do you flesh that out, how do you do all these things, it's just nature to me now, just because I've been doing it for 15 years, or well, way longer than 15 years now. Oh gosh, let's not get into that. 20 years now I've been doing this. Oh gosh. But I've been doing it for so long that it feels weird to me, the idea of not doing it. But I know that there are a lot of people, and I've watched the journeys of a lot of people who had never written before as far as a novel went, who then went on to write books and publish them and be very successful. So everything that I'm going to give you now as like a how-to are the things that I've learned over that 20 years of writing, squished, and focused largely on what I've learned in the last couple of years that have really changed my writing game and that have really helped me to figure out how I really need to write a novel. I'm also going to be sprinkling in a lot of you have to figure it out for yourself advice, because as much as I love formulas and how-to tutorials, the truth of the matter is that there are a lot of different ways that you can sit down and write a novel. As I get into these how-tos, just be encouraged that if one piece of advice doesn't work for you, I'm going to be giving you resources. My goal here is to give you as many resources as possible so that you can figure out what works for you and really thrive in it. So let's get started. And I put my hair up because, again, I'm pregnant and it's hot. So, okay. So here is my list of the top suggestions and top ideas for those of you who'd like to start novel writing. Here we go. The number one thing that I would do, the very first thing if you're considering writing a novel, is just to sit down and think about your story ideas. This will be a lot easier if you actually already have some ideas of what you might like to write for a story, but I know there are a lot of people who would like to write a novel but don't necessarily have an idea for a story concept. Like there's maybe some vague ideas, but it's hard to hammer it out. I would just take some time and think through the ideas that you do have. And if you don't have any ideas like nailed down, to start thinking through the kinds of stories that you like to read, the kinds of movies that you like to watch, the kinds of shows that you binge watch. What kinds of stories? Do you lean more towards stories with an element of a mystery? Do you lean more towards stories that are very heavily romance-based? Do you lean more towards stories that focus on drama and intrigue? Do you focus more on stories that are very heavy with like action-packed and whatever? Do you love a good book that is historically accurate? And that is incredibly important to you. As you start sifting through the kinds of stories that you enjoy watching and reading yourself, you'll find yourself coming up maybe with some ideas for the kind of story that you would like to write. once you have some ideas, just think through them, let them marinate, let them kind of just ruminate in your mind and become solid whole ideas. And as they do, you can move on to step 2, which is to start writing your ideas down. Some people call this brainstorming. Actually, most people call this brainstorming. For most people, that's just like the natural next step, is to just start writing down all the ideas that they have. Not in novel form, not in manuscript form, but just notes, like characters that you might want to write about, the concept of the story, like what the story might be all about, even if it's just the beginning. Maybe all you know about the story is the ending. Maybe all you know is some cool genre tropes that you like that you want to include, or maybe you were inspired by a movie that you didn't like, or a book that you didn't like how it had a twist that you, or something that you didn't like, and so how you would reverse that twist or how you would do it differently. Write down all the stuff that's in your head onto paper, into a Word document, into your phone, wherever you feel most comfortable, and then you can start moving on to kind of organizing it. This is not a defined step. Sometimes people call this part of their brainstorming process. Some people, they never move past just kind of jumbling the ideas out, and they go ahead and they start writing. But if you're very new to writing, then you're going to want to kind of organize what you've got going on. And the 3 number 1 things you're going to be looking at are your main character, your story concept, and your setting. So basically, all you need to really know to write a book is who the story is about, what the story is about, and where the story is set. With those 3 things, you can write a novel. This is where your individual writing preferences are going to start surfacing, and where it's important that you give yourself some grace in figuring out what your process is. There are 3 basic types of writers: plotters, pantsers, and plantsers, or plotsers, however you want to say it. Plotters are people who have to plan out every single detail of their story. They have to know every single thing about their main character's backstory, their likes, their dislikes, their hobbies, their interests, their this, their that. And then every single element of all the story, what happens from the very first chapter all the way through every single chapter until the very last chapter, and the details of everything. They have to know all of that before they can ever sit down and start drafting. A pantser is someone who, and this varies between person to person, but usually who knows those 3 basics: who they're writing about, what the basic idea is, and where in general it's set, and they can just start writing. And they sit down and they figure out all that other stuff as they write it. Some people call them discovery writers. They have to figure it out as they go, and they have to do it in a narrative form, or it doesn't excite them. That's how they figure it out. There are some very famous authors from both sides of that camp, but a lot of us actually fit right in between, and that is the 3rd type of writer, which is the plantser or plotzer. That's actually what I am. We are writers who, we do have to know something about what's going on in the book before we sit down to write it, but we also have to leave ourselves open to discovering more about the characters and more about the story along the way, and changing our outlines, changing our ideas, sometimes changing the entire book as we sit down and draft out the book. So as you're sitting down, thinking out through your ideas, think through who you are and how you normally approach a problem-solving thing. One of my favorite ways to do this is to consider how you handle instructions in a do-it-yourself kit. Do you like to actually read the instructions before you start working on the do-it-yourself project, or do you look at the project and just kind of jump in and figure it out as you go along? If you are more of the I have to read every instruction to make sure I have all the pieces and that everything is laid out in front of me correctly first person, you are most likely going to be a plotter, which means that after you figure out the 3 basics, you're going to want to go through and figure out everything else, which I'll talk about in just a minute. If you are the kind of person who just jumps right in and tries it for themselves and figures it out along the way, then guess what? You're probably a pantser. And again, I'll get to in a minute. And then their 3rd type of writer, a lot of times will shift back and forth. With some things, we have to know what we're doing first. With other things, we don't. For me personally, I have this bad habit where I will hastily read through the instructions, missing a lot of things as I go in my excitement to get to the project, start the project, realize I'm not doing it right, and go back to the instructions. That's how I figured out I'm a plantser. If you find yourself leaning more toward the plotter, where you like the idea of figuring it out before you start writing it, then the next thing that you're going to want to do is try some loose outlining. I say loose because, again, you want to give yourself some grace, some room to grow, some room to breathe. But basically, a loose outline would include the beginning of the story, where you think your story will be about in the middle, where you think your story is going to end, and then any details you can throw in the middle. If you are leaning more toward the pantser side, where you don't really want to do all that, you just kind of want to figure it out for yourself as you go, then just figure out where you want the story to start and start writing. All you need are those three things: character, story, and setting. Just figure out who the story is about, where the story starts, what kind of it is about, and where it takes place so that you know what to write about, and just start writing. During this whole brainstorming and figure out what kind of writer you are, something else that you really need to be doing is researching novel writing by reading books on writing, by listening to podcasts on writing, by watching videos on writing. Fill your brain with ideas and with inspiration on how to go about writing characters, writing character arcs, writing your plots and structuring your plots, dealing with subplots, dealing with narration itself. I will list an entire link. I will link a list. There we go. I will link some of my favorite resources in the description box below, but I can tell you that the number one resource that I recommend to everyone is the book called Goal, Motivation, and Conflict by Deborah Dixon. The hard copy that I have, which actually I rented to the friend that I'm doing this video for, is out of print now, so it's super expensive. But they do have an ebook copy that's just like under $10. So if you don't mind reading on your computer, then that is like the number one thing that I recommend to everyone. And that's something you can kind of read a little bit at a time as you're going through the process of brainstorming. But you can also read books by K.M. Weiland, Donald Mass, James Scott Bell, so many others. In fact, there are author, like the big name authors have written some too. I know Stephen King wrote one. He's a pantser. Brandon Sanderson has done some, not books, but some courses on writing fantasy. There are lots of people out there that you can look up, even just blog articles on their writing process. So just look up your favorite author if you want and look up what their writing process is and how they go about it and see if you can be inspired. And if you're reading those other books during this whole process, you'll be getting more and more ideas on what your novel needs to look like. My next tip is for plotters, pantsers, planters, everybody. One of the first things that I would do, maybe even before you consider outlining, if you're leaning more toward plotting, is to just write an opening scene. It doesn't have to be the very first scene of your book, but write a scene, write 2, maybe even 3 if you're feeling comfortable, that are from the character's perspective that you've chosen, whoever you've chosen to tell the story, or whoever is the story is about. Write a couple of scenes, a couple of happenings in your story, maybe a conversation with another character or them just sitting and thinking through some problems, maybe an action sequence or something of that nature. Write a couple of scenes and just get a feel for writing narrative. Because if you've never written a novel before, even if you are a writer who has done maybe nonfiction, if you've done blogs, if you've done something along those lines, it's still a slightly different thing writing novels as far as how you write it. So take a couple of scenes and just kind of figure out where your characters are, what their voices are, a little bit more about how you write. I also highly recommend that during this time you be reading the opening chapters of a variety of different books that you already love, that are from a style. I would definitely make sure that there are modern books, like recently published books, so that you're not, I grew up on classics, which means that my writing style used to be very classic, like Jane Austen-y. Needless to say, that doesn't really fly very well now, so definitely be reading more modernly published books. But just be reading the opening chapter of a lot of different books to kind of get a feel for how other people write their openings and how other people narrate the story. And that'll give you more ideas as you start writing those first couple of scenes, as you just write a couple of different perspectives maybe on how you want to write, and on what the narrative is going to look like, and on how it feels to write a fictional narrative instead of a blog or a nonfiction book or a giant post on social media or whatever it is that you usually end up writing. It's going to feel a little different, so kind of get a feel for it. Then once you have kind of figured out your voice, you figured out where you want to go, whether it be outlining or pantsing, go ahead and write the book. And this one is going to be very frustrating maybe at first, or very freeing, depending on what your original plan was, whether you're going to go in as a plotter or a pantser. If this is also where, though, I caution new writers, and even not new writers always, to not give yourself a deadline unless you absolutely have to. The first book should be a fun experience because it's your first experience, so it will kind of relate to the rest of your writing experience. If you work best under pressure, if you need a challenge, if you need something to make sure that you actually get this done, then do give yourself a deadline, but make sure that it is a very generous deadline and that you don't set a deadline for the entire book, because you have no idea at this point how fast you're going to write, how many words per writing session you're going to do, how many writing sessions per week you can fit in, and then how many writing sessions it's going to take you to finish the book. You don't know any of that yet. You're just starting. So give yourself some grace and maybe set a deadline for the first 3 chapters or the first 5 chapters, and give yourself a couple of weeks to fill that out, if not more. Then once you've hit that deadline, set another deadline. Maybe if you need a little extra push yourself a couple of days to get it done a little bit sooner. But yeah, definitely don't give yourself too big of a deadline, or too small of a deadline, I guess, too imposing of a deadline, like when you're going to finish the book. Just when you're going to finish this number of chapters, or when are you going to get to this certain plot beat? If you decided that you want to go with structure and you've looked up some outlining books, if you've looked up some outlining books and you feel like you want to go more the plotter way, anyways. If you don't work well under pressure and under deadlines, I normally don't, then don't worry about giving yourself any deadlines. Just focus on taking a little bit of time writing every week and getting into a habit of writing. Everyone should learn how to set deadlines for themselves if they want to be published. But even if you don't want necessarily to be published right away, or if that's not part of your immediate goals, everyone needs to set some kind of a writing routine just to make sure that you are making time for your writing. Otherwise, it can be something that doesn't end up getting done, which, even if you're not planning on publishing, can be very discouraging when you're not seeing any progress. My current writing schedule is to write Monday through Friday, kind of like a business week, and just write a little bit every one of those days, and then take the weekends completely off. Other writers that I know do every other day or 2 days a week. Some writers try to write every single day, only a couple of sentences, only maybe a paragraph or a page, but they write a little bit every day, and that's very important to them. Try a couple different writing routines. See if, okay, well, every morning before I go to work, or before I start on this project, I'll write a couple of paragraphs on my chapter and see how it goes. Or maybe, after everyone in the house is finally asleep, ooh, this is my time. I could set aside a little bit of time, every night after supper or after the kids are in bed, and I can write a chapter. I can write a couple of paragraphs. Play around with it. Try different things. See what works for you. Over time, this will show you what your writing routine needs to be, what's most comfortable for you, what works best with your schedule, and you can start doing it regularly, consistently, and that's what's going to get you through the novel. Even when you're stuck, it's what's going to help you get through the novel, because even if you're not writing on your book at that particular time every day or every week or whatever, you're still thinking about it, and that's the important part. Just bear in mind that at this point, you're not writing for a giant audience. You're not writing for the top 5 publishers. You are writing this book for yourself. So enjoy the process. Don't worry what other people are going to think about what you're writing. Worry about what you want to be reading in this part of the book. Think what you would like to write about in this moment. Embrace the cheesy dialogue. Don't care who's going to laugh at it, because no one else is going to read it. That would be another tip that I would give you, is don't give this to someone else unless you absolutely need to. Like, if your personality or your personal preference says, I need someone to look at this as I'm writing it and have that as a motivation, then pick someone that you trust a lot and that you love a lot and who knows not to judge you too harshly on your first attempt. Just don't be putting it up, immediately, your first ever attempt at writing, for everyone in the world to see. And don't worry too much about the feedback that you're going to get. Just write for yourself. Write the cheesy dialogue. Write the horrible description. Write the lousy action sequence. Just keep going through the book. This is also a part where I would like to say that there are 2 views on editing as you go, or fixing things as you go. There are people who very consistently will write a couple of chapters and then go back and try to fix the things that they didn't like and then keep going. There are other people who cannot do that, or they will get bogged down and rewrite chapter 1 over and over and over again, and so they just keep pushing forward. My suggestion if you are new to novel writing would be to follow the latter rather than the former. Go ahead and just push through and just keep writing and keep discovering what happens next, so that you do end up finishing the book, because you can always fix it later. But if you never get past chapter 1 or chapter 5 or chapter 10 and you just keep going back and fixing, your chapter 1 will look great, but you'll never actually have a full book, and it can be incredibly discouraging. So maybe kind of use this as a time to experiment with that as well. Maybe you're stuck at a point in the story, and I've done this before, and you can't move forward because something that you wrote was so bad it's bothering you. Yes, go back and fix it, and then keep going. Or maybe you realize that you want to go a completely different direction, so you take a break and you refigure out how the rest of the story is going to go. Just try not to get bogged down in, this has to be perfect. Just keep going. Just write the next scene, and then write the next scene. And then remember, you can always come back and fix it when the book is done. At the end of the day, remember, this is your first attempt writing a novel. So have grace with yourself, enjoy the process, have fun, and just really embrace everything that novel writing can be. One thing that I will add on is that if you are really struggling to find any kind of inspiration, or even if you're not, even if you're loaded with inspiration, one of the number one best things that you can do is to find a writing community. Whether this be in your town, online. I know right now most of us can't get out, and it's not really safe even for those of us who can. So online communities are going to be your best friend, even when all this quarantine is over, and even when things go back to normal. Online is going to be your best friend, because online you can just, send someone a message and they can immediately catch up with you. But look for Facebook groups, look for posts on Twitter by authors that you admire or that you're inspired by, and talk with the other authors in that. Look for groups. Follow other writers on Instagram, follow them on whatever social media platform. Look for author groups. Maybe there's some author groups on Goodreads or, somewhere like that. Just find a group that is in your genre or your target age audience maybe, and just hop on there and start asking questions. Respond to other people's comments and ask questions there. Get to know people. The more writers that you have in your life, the more free that you will feel to embrace that side of you that is a writer. Maybe if you are kind of intimidated by this whole process and you have a friend who's already a writer, lean into them. Get their advice. If they have been a friend a long time, then they'll know you and they'll be able to encourage you. Or a family member who maybe isn't a writer but who understands what you're doing and who's very supportive of you. Definitely reach out to them as well. Okay guys, this has been very long and very rambly, but I have loved this so much. I've wanted this video for a really long time, and I don't know why I haven't gotten around to it, but now I have. So there you have it, my writing journey and my tips for how to get started writing novels. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do, be sure to give it a like and consider subscribing on the way up, because I post writing content all the time on here, including all kinds of how-tos. Most of mine has to do with fantasy, but a lot of mine has to do with general writing process as well. And again, remember, a lot of resources will be linked in the description box below. Please don't leave before at least checking those out so that you can get more ideas, get more inspiration, and have some good tools in your toolbox as you head into this exciting experience. So that is all that I have for you today. Any information you need to know about me, my books, I do offer some services for writers. All of that's linked in the description box below, as well as my social media accounts where I share more writing tips and things. And yeah, I hope you all have an amazing rest of the weekend writing, or a beginning of the week starting writing for some of you. And I will see you all in my next video. Bye!